Chapter 16. A white mantle of deep snow lay over the land. This silent peace made Gutenberg Castle seem miraculously isolated from the world of reality. It was Christmas again. Enoch had been gone 4 years, and Philip France almost 2. In the short space of a few years, so much had transpired to alter our lives. This Christmas was a sad one, with dear ones behind prison walls and in concentration camps. But there was one note of joy, for on my return to Gutenberg in November, I had found awaiting me a letter from Carl Theodor. After all the heartaches and sorrow, there was at last good news. He was safe, a prisoner of war in England. Thanks be to God. Although my mother-in-law insisted on remaining in Würzburg, my own mother came to be with us. We tried to carry out some of our Christmas traditions to cheer the friends from bombed cities who had sought refuge under our roof. There were a few days of unreal peace and security, during which we could at least renew hope in our hearts. Late in January 1945, I found a friend who arranged a special introduction to the commanding SS general in Nuremberg. From him I hoped to secure some information about the Stauenbergs. I dreaded going to Nuremberg, for I had been told that the destruction from bombing there was now terrible. Even forewarned, I was not prepared for what I saw. Over the city there hung a pall of pinkish dust. Every gust of wind raised it like a veil, which Nuremberg drew about her to hide her wounds. The destruction was worst in the old part of the city, closely associated with my happy childhood. Like a litany for the dead, the cry came from my hearts. O city of beauty, crown of towers, shrine of Sebaldus, pride of Bavaria, seat of tradition, cradle of art, bridge of the past, you who have spanned 9 centuries of time, can this ignominious destruction be your destiny? No destruction anywhere had affected me so emotionally as the destruction of Nuremberg. Even while I was there, I had to spend long dust-choked hours in the underground shelters. I was so depressed that I was anxious to have my mission over and to leave Nuremberg as soon as possible. To my surprise, the SS general was extremely kind. He himself seemed to feel genuine sympathy for the men of July 20. He told me, strictly against orders, that the entire Stauenberg family were in the Stutthof concentration camp, far up in East Prussia. East Prussia? I cried. The army communique reports that the Russian invasion has already begun. I must go to Berlin at once and try to have them transferred further inland. I would advise you against going to Berlin now, the general cautioned. It would be most dangerous for you. The situation there is very tense. Here I can protect you, but my power does not reach beyond the Nuremberg area. Take my advice, Baroness, and remain here. In spite of his warning, I decided that it was my duty to go to Berlin. I was one of the few members of the family who had miraculously escaped prison, and it was up to me to leave no stone unturned in my effort to save the others. I knew all too well that the Nazi hangmen would never allow the Stauenbergs or any of the families of the July 20th men to fall alive into Russian hands. I sent word to Teresa Gutenberg that I intended to return to Berlin, and she joined me. On this journey to Berlin, the train was so packed that I literally could not find room to stand on 2 feet, so I balanced on one. The trip was interminable, for all the rail lines were under heavy bombing. The freezing night air came through the glassless windows, and the train stood motionless and completely dark for hours at a time. It is a strange thing that one can become almost insensible to physical discomfort. Life was like walking through a long, dark tunnel. One only knew that somehow, somewhere, there would be an end to it. The cataclysmic events which were taking place lent a feeling of unreality to everything we did. Again, Teresa and I were near collapse when we reached Berlin. Familiar streets were unrecognizable. The ruin was beyond belief. The air raids now continued night and day, and half of our time was spent in shelters. We were lucky to find again a room in the Adlon, although it was without windows and the temperature was far below freezing. In Berlin, the telephone service was now most erratic. Telephones worked only in certain parts of the city at certain times of the day. I finally reached Lita Stauenberg, and she came at once to our hotel. Lita was frantic. Her husband Alexander had been moved from the Mobith prison, and she could not find out whether he had been sent, like his twin brother young Berthold, to execution at Plötzensee or to join the other members of the family. She also told us that she had heard that the previous day brave young Count Helmut Moltke had been executed at Plötzensee. When Lita heard from me that the Stauenbergs were all in the Stutthof concentration camp in East Prussia, she shared my fears about their probable fate. I asked her if we dared to go again to her influential friend in the Prince Albrecht Strasse, but she told me that the man was not in the city. He had been unable to get any information for her about her husband, so it was unlikely that there was anything that he could do for us. Our hope lay in the fact that political prisoners in the concentration camps were constantly being shifted from one place to another. Lita decided to leave immediately in her own plane for East Prussia. The same SS secretary in the Prince Albrecht Strasse was still in charge of Karl Ludwig's case, and Teresa and I went to him. "It is absolutely impossible for you to see your husband," he told Teresa coldly. "He must give his entire thought to his trials, which are very important." Then he turned to me. "It will be useless to ask again." That, we both knew, was final. It could only mean that Karl Ludwig would soon be dead. Poor Teresa, how could I comfort her? She had hoped so desperately to see Karl Ludwig once more. I decided to remain in Berlin a little longer, for I had succeeded in getting an appointment with Himmler's adjutant. I was determined, if it was humanly possible, to have the Stauenbergs evacuated from the Russian zone. It was high time. The beaten German army was already flooding back from the Eastern Front. On the 3rd of February, I was in Berlin when it received the most frightful bombing of the war. One target that was hit was Gestapo headquarters in the Prince Albrecht Strasse. It was partially destroyed and badly burned. When the day came for my appointment, I was told that Himmler's adjutant had flown to the front to consult with his chief. I would have to wait. Wait! There was no time to wait. The Eastern Front had collapsed. Russian tanks had reached Strausberg and Nessen. Posen and Breslau had fallen. Berlin railway stations were seething with thousands of refugees, children crying for lost parents, mothers searching for lost children, mothers with dead, frozen infants in their arms. It was bitterly cold, and there was no place to shelter the thousands. Refugees stood for days and nights in the railroad stations or jammed into the subway tunnels. There was no hope for any of them. To add to the horror, there was the constant bombing. The shelters, already crowded, could not possibly hold these additional people. Misery, tears, horror. I thought of the terrifying dreams of my youth. This most certainly must be the climax of the days of evil. My memories of Berlin in the early weeks of February are an unbelievable nightmare. During the long waits in the stifling shelters, it seemed, as Karl Ludwig had said, that all hell was coming from the sky. In the cold rawness of dawn, the city burned. The air was suffocating with smoke and plaster dust and the smell of death. Wave after wave of bombers sent their missiles of destruction into the doomed city. Railway transportation was almost completely broken down, and it was rumoured that travel was to be forbidden. I began to worry about getting back to Bavaria. I could no longer risk remaining in Berlin. My first duty was to my children. For a last time, I walked past the dark Mobith prison, sending a silent message through its crumbling walls. Farewell, and God help you, dear, dear Karl Ludwig. The day that I left, there was such a rush toward the train, standing on an outer track, that I could not even get close to it. Suddenly the siren sounded for another air raid. The crowd turned and rushed toward the shelter, carrying me along in a human torrent. When at last it was safe to return, we found a mass of smouldering, twisted ruins. There had been a direct hit on the station. It was a long and difficult journey back to Gutenberg. Rides in wagons, on foot, buses and broken-down trains. When I reached home, I found that the mail was no longer being received, and that many telephone circuits were entirely destroyed. The house was filled with friends. More and more came to us to escape the bomb-wrecked cities. Only a few days after my arrival, the agent at the little railway station near Gutenberg telephoned. "The old Baroness has just arrived, and she seems very weak. Someone should come to take her up to the castle." I went myself in an old-fashioned horse and carriage, which was now our principal means of transportation. Most cars had been converted to the burning of wood, or, if one was fortunate, there was still a meagre supply of the ersatz gasoline. We had a little of this very low-grade gasoline, but it had to be carefully conserved. It was a shock to see my mother-in-law. She was gaunt and broken. I had last seen her when I had stayed with her in Würzburg at the time of old Count Berthold Stauffenberg's death. I had not even had a letter from her since Christmas. Now I learned that she had been desperately ill. In fact, I was sure that she was dying. In Würzburg she had been taken to the hospital, but with her remarkable strength and willpower she had slipped out of the hospital, determined to return to Gutenberg to die. Great sections of the railway between Würzburg and Gutenberg had been destroyed, but that did not deter her. She had made up her mind to go to Gutenberg, and nothing could stop her. She had walked almost half of the 200 miles, alone and ill, a woman of 83. It was unbelievable. In those days it was a common sight to see the right-of-way along the torn-up tracks, and the roadsides filled with people of all ages and stations, grim-faced people intent on reaching their respective destinations. The buses and other motor transportation were allocated almost entirely for military personnel. Along the way, my mother-in-law had been given occasional rides, but she had walked the greater part of the distance. When I took her into the house, she insisted on having dinner with us, although she could scarcely sit in a chair, and her face was distorted with pain. I will never forget how deeply I was moved at her courage, for, almost racked with pain, she managed to sit erect, with indomitable spirit and composure, surrounded by guests who were most of them strangers to her. Her famous wig had every hair in place. Her clothes, in spite of her long and harrowing journey, were in perfect order. Toward the end of the meal, even her strong will could no longer sustain her, and she began to sway. I put her to bed, and soon the doctor arrived. As I had suspected, he told me that she was dying, and the end was only a matter of weeks. We tried to persuade her to go with the doctor to a small hospital nearby. She was going to require good nursing, and, in a short time, hypodermics to ease her pain. Much as I wished to care for her, I was entirely without nursing experience. There was no possibility that the doctor would be able to come to Gutenberg as often as she was going to need him. But she was firm in her determination to die in Gutenberg Castle. After her heroic effort to reach her old home, I could not insist that she leave it again. 2 months of frightful suffering followed for her. It was I who did the nursing and gave her the hypodermics to alleviate her pain. She occupied the room next to mine, and while it was a great strain and a great responsibility, it was also a blessing for us both. During her last weeks, I learned for a fact what I had always felt in my heart, that she was a great woman. She knew that she was about to die and asked to see our chaplain. After she had made her peace with God, she was a different person. Although she was in constant pain, she had at last found peace of soul, and between us there grew love and understanding. When I entered her room, she would say, "Here comes my sunshine." We had long talks during her waking hours. "How close we are to each other, Elizabeth," she would say. "If we could only have been like this all through the years." We talked much about Enoch, and I told her many things which she had not known about us. She realized at last that between Enoch and myself there had always been, and always would be, a deep and eternal love. Late in March, I received a mysterious telephone call from an airbase in central Germany. "Is this Baroness Gutenberg? Please go to the airfield at Hof tomorrow morning." The connection was quickly broken, but I was sure that the message must have come from Lita Sternberg. The next morning, Good Friday, March 30th, I squeezed together enough gasoline to take me to Hof. As I walked on to the windy airfield, I was not surprised to see Lita standing in front of a small hut. She looked worn and sad. "Hello, Elizabeth. I have brought Clemens in my plane. The Gestapo has given him permission to go to Gutenberg. Even they realize that he is too ill to be sent from one concentration camp to another. The whole family is now in Buchenwald." Buchenwald? The very name of the ghastly place made me tremble, but I tried to hide my fear from Lita. She led the way into the hut, and there on a bench was Clemens. "Oh, God!" I put my hand to my mouth to stifle my cry. Clemens was like a corpse. I thought for a fleeting moment of his father, Count Berthold. Between us, Lita and I helped Clemens to his feet, which were so swollen that he could scarcely balance himself. He could walk only a short distance, and with great pain. "I must hurry back," Lita said anxiously when we were in the car. There was a hunted look in her eyes. "God be with you always." "God bless you, dearest Lita." She waved, and I waited until her plane had taken off down the field. Then I drove toward home with Clemens on the seat beside me. "How are Elizabeth and the children?" I asked cautiously. His voice was old and tired, scarcely more than a whisper. "As well as can be expected after 7 terrible weeks coming down from East Prussia. We were packed in freight cars in the freezing cold. We had nothing to lie on or even to sit on, but it is surprising how much one can endure. Only Nina's mother, Baroness Leschenfeld, died on the way. Our journey, terrible as it was, could not compare with what we saw. There were thousands and thousands of refugees from the Eastern Front. Bodies lay all over the road, hundreds of corpses of infants, starved and frozen." He put his hand over his eyes. "It's unbelievable what horror and human misery we have seen." When we arrived in Gutenberg, it was like a dream for Clemens, after having been dragged for 8 months from one prison to another. Very slowly, he began to recover. But he was reluctant to speak about what he and his family had endured. He did tell us about the weeks in the Stutthof concentration camp. At night, when we looked out our small window, the entire area was whitewashed with lime. Every fence, every shrub. The merciless searchlights showed up every inch of the ground, and the black figures of the guards passing up and down, up and down. Day and night we heard their steps, and the howling of the half-starved bloodhounds. And at night, sometimes, the screams of the poor creatures who tried to escape and were captured by the ferocious animals. Day and night we saw the smoke from the crematory furnaces and smelled their sickish odour. Day and night we waited for our own deaths. Oh, Elizabeth, what will happen to my family? I could not answer him. God alone knew. During April, my mother-in-law began to fail rapidly. Most of the time she was unconscious. I was glad, for during those weeks, American planes flying deep into Germany would swoop down on the castle and shoot into the windows of her tower room. It was a blessing that she could not hear the roaring machines. I prayed that one of the bullets would not reach the woman when she was in her death agony. In those last days, during her moments of consciousness, my mother-in-law was clairvoyant. She talked excitedly about what had happened to the home in Würzburg. She pictured to me graphically what she saw. She said that the house had been destroyed in a terrible bombing. The beautiful home in the Herrengasse was no more. She grew excited over possessions which she had been obliged to leave there. It was pathetic how she wept over the loss of little things of no intrinsic value. An old photograph, a baby shoe of Inak's, a fan which she had treasured. During the weeks in which I had been nursing the old Baroness, the German army had been utterly beaten. We all knew what a Russian invasion would mean for everyone, and we prayed each day in the chapel that the Americans would be the first to reach Gutenberg. During those last weeks of anxiety, Gibbus's oily voice came over the radio. He still spoke of a German end victory and boasted about mysterious new weapons which would turn defeat into triumph. All this with Russian troops in the outskirts of Greater Berlin and the British and Americans across the Rhine and deep into Germany. With the coming of spring, the trees were laden with blossoms, and flowers carpeted the woods around Gutenberg Castle. Spring seemed more beautiful than ever after the long, harsh winter. The days were filled with warm sun and the sweet song of birds, but what horror filled the nights! From my window, where my eager eyes had so often watched for Inak's return, I saw the endless ghostly columns of defeated Germany creep along the road through the valley. Tanks, guns, troops, hundreds of grey, tired men going south. Night after night, as I kept the death vigil for my mother-in-law, I saw the silent, ghost-like march of a beaten army. What a bitter and just end to dreams of world conquest! Then I realized that for Germany this was not the last agony. It was only the beginning of the tragic end. The bitter suffering which Germany had brought upon herself would go on and on. On the 13th of April, we heard over the radio the announcement of the death of President Roosevelt. And on that same day, word was brought to me that the Americans were in the little town of Untersteinach, about 3 miles from Gutenberg. Someone referred to them as the conquerors. For us, thank God, they were the liberators, for whose victory we had prayed. In the town of Gutenberg, at the foot of the hill, a few Nazis had built a tank barricade. When I heard about it, I hurried to see the major in charge. In God's name, I implored, open the way, Don't you realize that if you resist, it will mean the end of the town and the castle too?" "I have my orders," was his cryptic reply. "Then I shall give you another order. Remove that barricade." That was the language which he understood. The roadblock was removed, and within an hour a white flag was unfurled from the very top of the castle tower. We were careful to keep the gate securely bolted until we were told that the last of the SS detachment had withdrawn from the vicinity. But our information was wrong. Soon angry knocks came at the gate, and the SS officer in command shouted, "Away with that white rag, in the name of the Führer, or you will all be shot. My guns are loaded and aimed at this confounded nest of traitors." We did not have to answer. The American guns did that for us. They were firing from a spot about 2 miles up the valley. At the sound of gunfire, the SS man scurried away. 2 hours later we opened the gate, and with our hearts overflowing with gratitude, we awaited the arrival of the first Americans. During all that day we waited, but they did not come. The next morning word was sent to me that American troops had at last reached the village. I went out and stood on the wide steps overlooking the courtyard. In spite of my prayers that the Americans would come, I was frightened. A lone woman on the steps of Gutenberg to meet an approaching army. The sky was cloudless. Birds sang. I strained my ears for the sound of a motor or of marching feet, but I could hear only the wild pounding of my heart. Suddenly I remembered that I was standing on the very spot where Enoch had stood on our wedding day as he had spoken to his people. I thought of the welcoming speech made by the mayor and the little girls in white dresses who had presented me with roses. On that faraway day, all the scene had been blurred through my tears of joy. Now my burning eyes swept the deserted courtyard. The stillness was suddenly broken by the distant roar of a motor. In my mind, I followed it as it made its way up the steep and winding road. At last it reached the long avenue of ancient linden trees, and I tried to visualize this approaching enemy, but instead I saw in my mind a flower-decked car moving along under the linden trees, with Enoch at the wheel. Enoch, young and handsome, in his naval dress uniform, and I beside him, in my bridal gown, coming to Gutenberg for the first time. I felt terribly, achingly alone. "Dear God," I whispered, "take all fear from my heart. Enoch, Enoch, how desperately I need you in this hour." As always, when I called to him, a great feeling of calm came over me, and Enoch seemed to be standing there at my side, his arm about me, reassuringly. The noise of the approaching motor grew louder and louder. Then, through the gate, lumbered a huge tank, bristling with guns. It circled the courtyard and stopped. "Hello! Does anyone speak English?" a voice called from the depth of the monster. "Yes, I speak English," I replied, although I scarcely recognized my own voice. A young soldier with a red scarf tied around his neck poked his head out. "We're thirsty. Can we have something to drink?" As I studied the soldier curiously, my fear receded. He was blond and rosy-cheeked, perhaps a little older than Carl Theodor. "Come in and have a glass of wine." "Thanks," the young man said, as he swung himself to the ground. "Have some chocolate in exchange." Other tan-clad soldiers came from inside the tank, as the first soldier leaned back and looked up at the walls of the castle. "Let's have a look at this place. Mighty old, isn't it?" "About 700 years, I told him, as I led the way. The young man whistled. "That was before Columbus discovered America. Quite a while before." he added as he did a little mental arithmetic. We passed through the wide door, which had seen many other conquerors, but certainly none as strange as this friendly soldier from the New World. He looked around the rooms with an appraising eye. "You have some mighty fine things in here. I'm afraid that they might make very good souvenirs." He pulled his red handkerchief closer around his neck. "I think what this place needs is an off-limit sign." To my astonishment, he took out of a pocket a bright red lipstick. He asked for a large piece of paper on which he wrote with a flourishing red dash, "Off-limits to all troops, 3rd Armoured Division." At the time I did not realize the high value of that masterpiece, but I soon learned to appreciate what it meant to have it fastened to the great oak gate. After a tour of inspection, the monster and its friendly crew departed. Several weeks later, I was told that a young American captain wished to see me in the library. I went at once, and as I entered he rose respectfully, saluted and introduced himself. "Captain Castle-de-Mont, Baroness. I regret that military personnel will have to be billeted in the castle." "You are welcome to use the entire house," I replied, but I was worried. "That will not be necessary. We wish to inconvenience you as little as possible." I studied the captain. He was a handsome young man with dark hair and blue eyes. I had 2 young and attractive daughters. What would it mean having military personnel in the house? The safety of my daughters was a very serious responsibility for me. I could not very well confine them to their rooms. I decided to do with this problem what I had done with all of the other serious ones which had confronted me. I laid it in the hands of the good God who had so miraculously shielded us from harm. The next morning, as I knelt at the communion rail, I again gave the problem into divine hands. Someone came and knelt beside me to receive Holy Communion. It was the young captain whom I had met the previous evening. This, I was sure, was God's speedy answer. From my military guess, I knew I had nothing to fear. Almost all of my time was taken up in nursing my mother-in-law and watching over Clemens Stauenberg. At first Clemens seemed to improve, but he was grieving his heart out. My mother-in-law grew weaker each day. Her periods of unconsciousness became longer. She talked in her delirium about Karl Ludwig and her daughter Elizabeth. She suffered profoundly because she seemed to know what they were enduring and that she would never see her children again. We knew nothing of what was happening in Berlin, and it was just as well. The great tragedy was almost over. Russian tanks rolled into Berlin on the 21st of April. Most of the July 20th heroes who were still imprisoned were taken out by a frantic Gestapo and shot in the rubble and ruins of the city. The last news of the Stauenberg family was that they were still in Buchenwald, near Weimar. On a May evening, her room filled with the lilacs of Gutenberg, which she loved, my mother-in-law died. She was beautiful in death, a black veil draped around her head, her noble face relaxed and smiling. She was buried in the crypt under the chapel with generations of Gutenbergs. I thanked God that he had given us a few brief weeks to know and to love each other. There was now no means of communication, and in Gutenberg we were almost completely isolated. But several days before the death of the old Baroness, we learned that her vision of the destruction of Wurzburg had been uncannily accurate. It was at the end of March that Wurzburg and all its beauty had been destroyed in one of the most terrific bombings of the war. In 18 minutes, 97% of the city was in ruins. Every 10th person had died in the Holocaust. Only 3 of its 80 beautiful churches survived. I later talked with someone who had lived through the horror. It was an apocalyptic tragedy. Houses fell apart like paper. Waves of flame rolled over the city. People who escaped their collapsing homes threw themselves into the river main. But even the surface of the water was an eddying molten mass from the phosphorus bombs.